Hey everybody. So today what we're going to be talking about is we're going to talk about George H.W. Bush's time in office. Today in particular, what we need to specifically talk about is the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is a huge ordeal that takes place in the late 80s, early 90s, is going to fundamentally change the way the world. But the first thing that we need to talk about here is the 1988 election. All right, so 1988, Ronald Reagan, if he could serve for a third term, he absolutely would. People would have voted him in, but that's not an option. Now there's a constitutional change that you can't serve more than 2 terms. So in 1988, George Herbert Walker Bush, who was his vice president, is going to run for president, and he's going to win because he's associated with Ronald Reagan. The thing that he says is important, because we'll come back to it, when he's running for president, see, Ronald Reagan had really slashed taxes. Again, during Ronald Reagan's time in office, you were able to have your cake and eat it too. Trying to get us out of this recession that had happened in the 70s, they just cut all taxes. Like, you weren't even paying taxes. They were spending tons of money. You can't do that long term. You just can't. It'll make your country collapse. So everybody keeps wanting to have their cake and eat it too. So at some point, you know, the other shoe will drop, or whatever the saying is, that they're looking at George H.W. Bush, and he says it over and over and over. It's this campaign slogan: "Read my lips, no new taxes." He's like, "Hey, I'm not going to raise taxes. I'm going to keep it the way it is. Everything's going to be great." There's going to eventually be a war, not associated with Russia, but there is a war that happens while he is president, and taxes have to increase. And that footage of him saying, "Read my lips, no new taxes," is really going to hurt him when he tries to run for re-election in 1992. But so 1988, George H.W. Bush ran against a guy named Michael Dukakis. I guess we're so far along, and this is so recent, that we start talking about the guys who lose the elections as well. But he said, "Read my lips, no new taxes." It was like his big campaign slogan at the time. And this is, again, George Bush Sr. Play.
I'm not questioning his patriotism.
I'm
questioning his judgment.
Friends, this is garbage.
The presidential candidates hold debates. Bush has managed to overcome a huge 14-point gap in the polls. Bush's hardball politics are working, and Dukakis does not seem able to play against him in the big leagues. But George Bush's victory is decisive. He wins 54% of the popular vote and carries 40 states.
To those who supported me, I will try to be worthy of your trust. And to those who did not, I will try to earn it, and my hand is out to you, and I want to be your president too. Thanks for everything, and God bless America. Thank you all very much.
So that's George H.W. Bush comes in as the president. So what we've been talking about since World War II, since Joseph Stalin, is the Cold War. All right? It has occupied like everything that has happened in the United States for a really long time. So we had talked about Reagan, his SDI, Star Wars program. It kind of puts Russia on the defensive. Looking back on it, it's just comical that was a big turning point, but it was. Now, a lot of that is Mr. Wagstaff, who I do kind of view. I don't know what you would classify as an expert on subjects. Like, at what point are you classified as an expert? So people throw that word around pretty loosely. If you're loosely throwing the word around, I am an expert on the subject. If you're looking for a doctorate on it, people who have had work published and things like that and peer reviewed, then no, I'm not an expert. But I would know more than a lot of people just because I've spent so much dang time doing it. The SDI program doesn't get enough credit because they never admit to it. Russia does that. That's what brought them down. But you can tell with the way they spent money and the moment that came out and their reaction and their policy changes towards it, it absolutely was a big change. So you're going to see that get exacerbated here. George H.W. Bush is credited, and let me tell you why it's so dumb, all right, of why people don't use logic when it comes to the end of the Cold War. So while it seems silly to think a fake program of space nukes could bring down the Soviet Union, you're like, hey, yeah, it's got to be better than that. Here's what people actually think, like the Christopher Columbus discovered America type, like just that basic, it's called popular history, just that standard, like, hey, let's not look into this, here's what happened. So Ronald Reagan, at the very end of his term, goes to Germany, all right, to Berlin, to West Berlin, the half the city that we own that's surrounded by the wall. And he gives a speech in which he says, Mr. Gorbachev, who is the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, he says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Like, he says it in a big speech. Shortly after that, in 1989, the wall gets torn down. All right? People literally want to believe that Ronald Reagan went out there and said words and the entire Soviet Union cowered in fear and tore that wall down because Ronald Reagan told him to. It was a coincidence. It would be like me standing outside right at sunset and I'd be like, son, you go down now. And then like sits behind and everybody's like, Mr. Wesneff can control the sun and the moon. It was going to happen whether he gave that speech or not, but he gets credit for it. So while it seems silly that the SDI really shut down the Cold War, what people want to believe is even dumber than that Ronald Reagan's words got it to happen. He was popular, but he's not going to shut down the Cold War by words. Otherwise, somebody would have said words a long time ago. So, without going into the extreme intricacies of what happens in Russia and the Soviet Union, I'm going to do my best to explain to you how the Cold War is going to end using general concepts and terms. It is so just like in American history when you talk about the creation of the Constitution. Checks and balances, three-house legislature, who gets what, the three-fifths compromise versus the great compromise, and how when you get really complicated. In order to fully understand how the Cold War collapsed, you would have to understand that in Russia, all right? There's no point for the scope of this course to go into that much detail. So I'm going to really simplify this, all right? So if anybody out there is an expert on the collapse of the Cold War, yes, I am smoothing over some surfaces to make the story very straightforward, to give you like a Wikipedia background, like an accurate Wikipedia background over what is going to happen. So if this stuff piques your interest, there's tons of stuff to go look at because it's really cool. All right. So after SDI, there's two concepts that are going to come out in Russia. It's called Glasnost and Perestroika. All right. These two words simplified that Russia is going to try to be more like America. Not like America, more like a democracy. They don't, America's still the enemy. But it looks like Russia's not going to win. The 50 years now of hardcore communism is jumping on the back of Russia. Or really, 70 years. The whole concept that you can't move up in society has just worn the society down. They can't produce stuff. I got tons of anecdotal evidence, means that individual stories from individual people that I know, with all really interesting stuff about Russia and how garbage their products were at the time. I'll tell you one. So I used to coach wrestling. All right, I coached some at Davie with Buddy Lowry, and it's kind of interesting. The two coaches I wrestled for are both in the North Carolina Hall of Fame. The other one was at Central Davidson High School, named Jay Lineberry, who is an absolute monster himself. Anyway, he, in the 1980s, all right, he was touring with the U.S. Olympic team. All right, so when I say the guy's good, he's good. He wrestled for the national championship in college for Elon a couple of times. He didn't win it, but it's a touchy subject. So he was good, really, really good. So he toured, and Russia's a big wrestling country. So at the Olympics, he was training with the Olympic team or something, but he was in Russia, all right, during the Soviet Union. So you'd get passes and stuff, like for sports and stuff, they would let you in there. And they got like take some tours of stuff of like what they would let them see, and they'd see like all these tanks lined up. So this was like when Russia's not doing good. All these tanks, these mass produced, and the story was only the tanks that had gotten built like in the first couple weeks of the month worked. All the tanks after that didn't work because you had a quota that you had to come up with a certain amount of tanks. Didn't matter if they worked or not, they just had to be out. So people took their time on the first couple weeks of the month of making them work and function, but then once they were behind schedule, they would race through and get as many out as possible because they had to hit a deadline, and it didn't matter if they worked or not. So any of the tanks that were produced in like the last half of the month just didn't work. And this was common in a communist country where there's this schedule that you have to keep, and there's no flexibility on top of other things that were issues. So it was obvious that my I'm listening to my kids scream upstairs. I don't know if that picks up in the mic. They're just fighting each other to death. It's what they do. So, man's stupid brain. What was I talking about? So, anyway, communism, it's obvious that it's going down. Gorbachev is the leader. He's going to do some things differently. He's going to open it up, all right? So, here's what starts happening. So, there's the Soviet Union, which is Russia plus all the stuff that they own. That's the Soviet Union. Gorbachev is the leader of the Soviet Union and Russia. He starts doing stuff. He makes a separate leader of Russia and a separate leader of the Soviet Union, even though he's the same position like Stalin was. He implements these concepts of perestroika and glasnost, which means openness. Like, hey, let's start talking to other countries. The big thing that he does is, in those two concepts, is allows communist countries to decide for themselves if they want to be a satellite nation. So, because Russia is struggling to provide for everybody because their infrastructure doesn't work real well long-term in communism, they're starting to get grumpy. But if they talk trash, they get like shot in the streets, which makes them angrier. So Gorbachev genuinely believes that the reason they're so upset is they don't have the choice to stay. He thinks if he gives them the option of staying, it's almost like a kid. It's like, I want to run away. And he's like, 5. And you're like, fine, leave. They might leave, get to the end of the driveway, and come back and be like, okay, this is better. I'm not going to leave. This is the logic that Gorbachev is going to take. He's like, fine, if you guys want to leave, leave. Not worried about it at all. Guess what? They gone. They like take off immediately, and he's like, uh-oh. So when he allows these satellite nations to make their own decisions, they take off. The most famous one in 1989. So this is, people talk about it all the time. It's the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is a photograph. I got a video clip of it. The Berlin Wall coming down is crazy. So there's East and West Germany. West Germany is owned by America. It's a democracy. All right, we don't own them. They're a democracy. That we treat them as a normal country. East Germany is a communist country. Now, Germany is a very proud people. They want to be one country again. At no point did they want to continue being divided. So what ended up happening was East Germany, when they said this, East Germany was afraid of the wrath they could get from Russia, because Russia and Germany have had beef, even though Russia controls East Germany. East Germany's government just quits. Just quits. Like, just doesn't show up to work anymore. And so there's like no government running East Germany. And this is like all on purpose. I'm sure there's some type of communication that had happened here. So the idea is, hey, let's let West Germany like take over East Germany. We just become Germany again, running as a democracy. So when the East German government just doesn't show up to work, all right, everybody's like, what's going on? Like, this is the first like battlefield, I guess, like not actual shoot, but what's going to happen here? How's Russia going to respond? Russia doesn't do anything. Gorbachev doesn't respond when they don't show up to work. So what happens? Immediately, all these people show up and they start. They storm into. So these are people from the Soviet side that are going to this wall, and they're on both sides, but they go to this wall, and they start tearing down the wall. All right, this is shortly after Ronald Reagan had made a visit, but tearing down this wall. The people show up, and they start tearing down this wall. So people are just going to pass back and forth between East and West Berlin now. You know what Russia does? Nothing. They let it happen. They let this wall get torn down. They let people from West Berlin or West Germany into East Germany and vice versa. Then Germany decides there's no longer West Germany and East Germany. We're now Germany again. This is monumental. This is a country who just says we are no longer communist. We are done shutting it down. We're no longer part of the Soviet Union. We're our own democracy. Boom, communism, get out of our country. They become a democracy. This is why us and Germany really like each other today, or we're like we're big fans of Germany. We support them. Germany doesn't they're not best friends with us like England is, because they'll still talk trash to us. But we give Germany a lot of respect because they're the first ones that just bowed up and said communism is out. We're done. When they become their own country, Gorbachev and Russia do nothing. They're like, okay, we accept that. They're their own country now. Other communist countries are like, wait, we can just like leave for real and you're not going to invade us? Because that was the original thought. If you leave, you're just going to get killed. They're like, and like people just start like taking off. Like they can't physically leave, but they're leaving the Soviet Union. These countries are providing Russia with supplies and things like that. Without getting these supplies or anything, Russia can't continue being communist, but without having the supplies from their satellite nations, as their satellite nations are leaving, and Russia is going to have to change here. I got a video clip here. Should be the Berlin Wall coming down. Very famous in 1989 when it happened.
The beginning of the end for the Berlin Wall came in 1989. East Germany was in a deep political crisis. Increasingly, East Germans were openly protesting against the government. This culminated in a mass demonstration of 500,000 people. In November 1989, the East German government resigned and a new government took over. The new leadership promised to remove travel restrictions between East and West Germany. The country's border with West Germany was opened. For the first time in more than 28 years, Germans could pass freely from east to west. Joyful Berliners began to tear down the wall, and thousands of East German citizens swarmed across the border. Today, the Berlin Wall is gone. The only remnants are a row of cobblestones marking its position in downtown Berlin.
Yeah, I'm glad to admit it, because so the Berlin Wall doesn't exist today. You can go. I had a friend in college who took a trip to Germany, and she got she came back with a little glass vial of the Berlin Wall. Like they crush up and they sell it to, I'm sure $10 for a little glass vial of like little crushed up rocks of the Berlin Wall that they sell because it's so famous. But I'm always like, you can just crush up anything and put it in a little vial and be like, oh, this is the Berlin Wall. Like it really means anything. You have no way of knowing if that's legit or not. So it seems good for America, but it gets squirrely in Russia. It's not over, right? Because there's still some danger here. So the Soviet Union collapses. How do you think the people in Russia feel about Gorbachev? A lot of them do not like this. Now, a lot of them realize that is moving forward, that people are going to start getting more rights, the government's going to respect people more, all that. There's a lot of conservatives, people who like the way things used to be, that are furious with Gorbachev. So there's a group of conservative communists, all right? They're like Bolsheviks, like the original people who support the old way of doing things. They are so angry at Gorbachev that they go take him hostage to try to force him to make the Soviet Union back again. Like, you can't put toothpaste back in the tube. Once these satellite nations are gone, they're gone. So Gorbachev gets taken hostage. Like, it's by guys with guns. The guy that's going to come negotiate his release, because Gorbachev is released, all right, is kind of Gorbachev's political arch nemesis. Like, Like you got, if Donald Trump is, who would Donald Trump's arch nemesis be? Maybe the Speaker of the House, which is still Democrat, which is Nancy Pelosi. Maybe those two, which would be about the equivalent. Like Boris Yeltsin is the guy that's getting ready to come out and have Gorbachev released. And he's going to do the negotiations, even though it's like Gorbachev's big political rival. They're still like, yeah, you can't like just abduct people. So Boris Yeltsin shows up and gets Gorbachev released. All right, it does not work out well at all for the kidnappers. I'm pretty sure they're all executed. But so Russia shows up and says, "Look, you can't do that." They let Gorbachev be released. Gorbachev, very unpopular in Russia. He's just been kidnapped, like almost killed. When he is released by his kidnappers and from being held hostage, he's like, "I quit. I'm done. I'm out." So who's the next guy that has to step up and lead Russia in this really uncertain future? This is a guy named Boris Yeltsin. The reason this is really important for America, how many nukes does Russia have? If Russia collapses, they still have these nukes. If they get crazy, because when a revolution happens, you don't know. We made all these deals with strategic arms limitations treaty, SALT 1, SALT 2, the INF. We made all these treaties with the communist government of Russia. So if the communist government disappears, none of those treaties matter anymore, but they still have the nukes. So America, well, yay, they're going down, the bad guys. We got to make sure like crazy people don't come into power here. So we are really concerned on what's happening here. While it looks like it's good for us because communism is collapsing, there is still a very inherent danger here in the early 1990s over what's going to happen in Russia now. So Russia ends up completely collapsing. So sorry, let me rephrase that. The Soviet Union collapses. Russia still exists, but Russia loses like all control of their satellite nations. And they just kind of break off and go do their own thing, and Russia is left on its own. But Russia's the one that has all the nukes. But they can't even afford to keep their nukes now. So what's going to happen to them? Watch this and we'll talk about that more.
After months of Glasnost, Perestroika and various measures to strip the Soviet Communist Party of most of its power, by August the 19th, 1991, the hardliners decided they'd had enough. In a show of force, the plotters sent columns of tanks to surround strategic buildings in Moscow. But the conspirators had reckoned without the will of the people, who weren't going to allow a return to the bad old days without a struggle. As the crowds tried to stop the advance of the tanks, inside the Russian parliament building, the reformers were trying to work out what to do. President Gorbachev, on holiday in the Crimea, was now under arrest. It was left to his longtime political rival Boris Yeltsin to take up the challenge. He emerged dramatically to confront the besieging troops. Yeltsin's dramatic stand had convinced the plotters they couldn't win. Hours later, President Gorbachev himself returned to Moscow from his house arrest in the Crimea. It was the end of the most revolutionary 24 hours in Russian history.
So they're talking about her arrest. I'd said kidnap. When your government is like being torn apart by your leader is like, yeah, we're going to take our constitution, our entire basis, and we're just going to destroy it. He gets arrested by like the party, the people that he's trying to get rid of. It's a very, revolutions are really complicated. So I use the term kidnap, they use the arrest, and neither one of them are wrong, yet maybe neither one of them are right. It was, everybody thought they were doing the right thing, they're doing the best thing they could. It is important that Boris Yeltsin, who was against Gorbachev, comes out and is more like Gorbachev than he would be a typical Bolshevik. So this is Boris Yeltsin right here. So when Gorbachev basically says communism's done, well, let me simplify. Communism's done if he says that, all right? Then the hardcore communists take to the streets in tanks and stuff. They're like, no, we're not. Boris Yeltsin, who is a communist, he basically confronts the tanks and is like, nah, this is just where it's going. Like, you got to back down. You can't do this. And then after that, Boris Yeltsin is going to end up being the leader here in Russia moving forward in the early 90s, and we got to figure out like what's going to happen. So Boris Yeltsin comes to power to rule over the broken pieces, collectively known as the Commonwealth of Independent States here in the Soviet Union as they break off. Russia and the United States creates the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, START 1. This is really important. So we go to Russia. We know they don't have any money anymore. Russia's collapsed. And this is still a current issue that we have with Russia, and it's a very unique one. So they have like thousands of nukes. We have thousands of nukes. It costs billions every year just to maintain them so they don't accidentally explode on your own country. We know that because that's what we spend, all right? Spends billions and billions of dollars to take care of your nukes. Russia doesn't have that anymore. So what we do, and we still do this to present day, and it starts with the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. We go and we're like, hey, can we limit nukes? Russia will limit nukes. They're like, absolutely, let's get rid of nukes. So, but they'll only go down to where we are. Now, we're going to keep a whole lot more nukes than they can afford, right? So that was our first play. Russia won't give them up, all right? Russia won't have less nukes than we have. But we know they can't afford to have that many nukes because it takes a lot of money for maintenance. So we offer to buy their nukes from them, to give them money. Russia won't do it. To present day, they will not sell us their nukes, all right? So you can't just dismantle them. It's a really complicated thing with nukes. So our biggest fear right now, present day, still is Russia having all these nukes that they can't afford them, so they might sell it because they still view us as an enemy. In 2020, still view us as an enemy. All right? We are terrified they will sell nukes to terrorists, and terrorists will use their nukes on us. We're afraid this will happen if Russia can no longer afford to maintain their nukes. Guess who pays Russia to maintain their nukes? We do, present day. We give Russia the money to maintain their nukes so that they won't be tempted to sell them to somebody else. We're like, we will buy them from you, and they say, nope. And we're like, oh, all right, so I guess we'll pay you to keep them. They do dumb stuff in Russia. There's a whole situation called Chernobyl where they have a nuclear power plant that erupts and like kills a bunch of people. Like, they're not always responsible with their nuclear technology. So we feel it's our obligation to pay them so their nukes don't accidentally explode and they don't get in a tough situation where they feel like they have to sell it to one of our other enemies. So the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty kind of is the beginning of that. Though we both agree we don't need as many nukes if we're clearly the Cold War is about over at this point. Or if it is not completely over.
December the 3rd, 1989 was the day the Cold War ended officially, and the unlikely venue was the tiny island of Malta in the Mediterranean. Leaders of the two superpowers had agreed to meet there to finalize the details of agreements that would revolutionize relations between them. President Bush had come to Malta with a whole range of proposals and agreements to be signed by President Gorbachev on board the Maxim Gorky cruise ship. Mind you, it was hardly cruising weather at the time. Not that it worried the president.
Hell no. Hell no. Summit's going. That's fine. Thanks.
They finally got together. The two sides agreed to halve their strategic nuclear weapons, reduce conventional forces in Europe, destroy chemical weapons. And President Bush agreed to end curbs on Soviet trade with the United States.
So there's a lot of, hey, let's get rid of some nukes. If you're not going to be communist, we can start trading again. We're going to help you out. So a lot of trade does start with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union's feelings are really hurt. All right. So we don't like Russia any additionally. All right. Russia doesn't like us any additionally, but they've clearly lost this Cold War and they're grumpy. And up to present day, they're just not friends with us. So there is a lot of grumpiness between our two countries. But the fear of a nuclear war is not there as much because we're not both trying to take over the world anymore. This is a picture of Boris Yeltsin. All right. Tiananmen Square. So, as the Russia collapses and is no longer communist, there is a country right next to Russia called China that is communist under Mao Zedong. All right. And shoot, at this point, Mao Zedong is not in charge, but they're still communist. All right. So understand, China has seen the issues that take place with communism in Russia. In large part, that it collapses when people can't move up. That is a difference in China. China lets people be rich in China. There is a class system in China, which in most communist countries is completely outlawed. So they have a unique system of communism. They are communist in their treatment of equal rights and speaking out against the government and stuff like that. But as far as if you become rich in China, you can be rich in China. That is the big difference, and that's one of the reasons that China has flourished from an economic standpoint, and other countries that attempted to be communist have not. There are no rights for individuals really in China. So to give you an example of what the government can do in China, and I think they just lifted it, but it was, the whole world freaked out over this because it seems so immoral. They have such a big population that China implemented a one-child rule, that you can only have one child because their population was getting out of control. People were furious at this, that they could control like the most intricate thing of human existence, which is having children, that the government could tell you if you could or couldn't have children. So it's kind of crazy that the government went to that extreme. There'd be, I don't know what the punishments were for having more than one kid, but they were, in China, they're typically severe. I do know, sadly, the way Chinese culture is set up is that sons are supposed to take care of their parents when their parents get too elderly. That's the expectation in China. So if you can only have one kid and you had a daughter, especially in poor communities, if you had a daughter, your retirement plan is screwed. So what they would do is they would just give up their daughter for adoption and pretend like they never had a kid so that they could have another kid. So as soon as the baby's born, they give it up for adoption. The amount of girls in orphanages in China is staggering. And then if you've known anybody that's gone through the adoption process, it is a very, very difficult process. And to think there's all these people around the world that would love to adopt children, but it's like crazy expensive and super difficult to do. And in China, and it's just, there's all this bureaucracy between families around the world and in places like China that have tons of orphans, a bunch of children that would love to be adopted. And there's so many people that stand in the way of good families and these children that keep those from making a connection. Now, at the same time, they're also, the goal of all those people that seem to stand in the way of the good families and these kids are standing in the way of the bad families and the kids to prevent bad families and bad people from, buying children for sex trafficking or other just horrific things. So while the adoption process is very hard, there is, a reason to the madness. But all that comes out really here in China. So there are some human rights issues taking place in China. So when the Soviet Union collapses, the people in China are like, hey, Russia right next door, they just became a democracy-ish, we'll put that in quotes. We want to as well. So millions of college students come out to an area in the capital of China called Tiananmen Square. It's like Times Square, I guess. But it's a huge like open park. It's concrete like gathering place. Now, protesting is illegal in China. But the logic is, hey, if millions of us show up to protest, what are they going to do? It's not like they're going to like shoot us all or like send in the tanks. That's exactly what China does. These students show up to protest their government. They want to become a democracy as well. This is in the early 1990s. The Chinese government responds by sending in tanks and their military and opening fire on them and arresting thousands and thousands of people. And I mean, tons of people. It's crazy. Here's how crazy. So the Chinese is like, nah, we're going to be communists. Ain't nothing you can do about it. The craziest part about this is if you go to China today and you try to look this up on the computer, you can't find it. It is like wiped off the face of the earth. This whole event, the Tiananmen Square fiasco, I got a video of it here. But on the internet in China, they very much are able to control what is seen on the news and what you see in the media and all that. So these tanks rolling down the road to the Tiananmen Square is a crazy situation that happens. Absolutely baffling. And in China, they have expunged it. So, like, if you're Chinese and you travel anywhere else, you can learn about it. But if you go back, you're not even allowed to talk about this. The government ain't playing in China. They're like, nah, not a thing. So Tiananmen Square was China's attempt to try to become a democracy, and their government's like, nah, we ain't like Russia. We ain't collapsing. We're strong, and don't be doing this junk.
China, a country not much larger than the United States, but home to 5 times as many people, has been under communist rule since 1948. Their students and intellectuals to demonstrate peacefully against the oppressive communist regime. Demonstrations continued, and thousands of dissenters pour into Tiananmen Square, a plaza facing the People's Hall and the portrait of Mao Zedong. The number of people in the square swells to over 1 million. Art students erect the 33-foot-tall Goddess of Liberty. She becomes the symbol for a movement that will not be tolerated. In the dark of night, tanks roll into Tiananmen Square, crushing vehicles and students. The battle rages for hours. Some estimate that as many as 7,000 students are killed by gunfire. Remnants of the democracy movement are destroyed. The government begins a massive campaign to round up the dissidents. Over 10,000 persons are arrested. 31 are executed for their crimes against the state. But the spirit of the democracy movement will be remembered by the picture of one man standing up for freedom, now and in the future.
So that picture there, I showed you this picture, sorry. I had my picture ever. Look, there he is. Oh, picture means a whole different, it's 4 tanks. Like, what in the world? So this guy, they don't know who he is. But I do know the tank, the guy in this tank was fired or kicked out of the military, which is a pretty serious thing to happen because he wouldn't run him over. But they don't know who this specific guy was. He probably would not. Bad things would probably happen to him if the government found out who this guy was, who this protester was, because that's not tolerated in communist China. All right, so the Cold War is over. Communism still exists in China. Now, there is a really cool, completely random story that happens. Oh, man, this is crazy. So, when George H.W. Bush is president in the United States, they start the war on drugs, which is just very, very, adamant. The idea is if you make really strict punishments for drugs, drug use will go down. That has really, looking back on it now with our data, it doesn't really seem to have been a big persuader. But in the 1980s, under George H.W. Bush, the whole war on drugs is really going to kick off. Now, cocaine has become popular in America as far as an illegal drug. So George W. Bush, H.W. Bush, realizes a lot of the cocaine that comes into the United States is coming from Central America. So a lot of places in Central America make cocaine. All right, it's a relatively complicated process. It's not like a powder that grows on a tree. You have to do stuff to it. It's a complicated process. So the thing is that these countries that make cocaine, they can't really sell it in their own country and make a bunch of money because it's not in high demand there. So they're going to sell it in America. So what they do is they take they're going to take their cocaine in the Central American countries and they're going to try to sell it in America. Most famously, there is a country called Panama, or the Panama Canal goes through. They have a military dictator, a guy named General Manuel Noriega. All right. Clearly, Panama is supporting the growing and creation of cocaine and selling it in America, which is really illegal. They're sneaking across the border, selling it in America. So George H.W. Bush goes down, he not personally, but he basically contacts General Manuel Noriega, and he's like, "Hey, General Noriega, are you selling cocaine in America?" Now, if you're Manuel Noriega, what would be the appropriate response here? Probably, no, I'm not. Or, if he wants to be like less of a turd, "Hey, I am, my bad, I'm going to stop. You're right, drugs are bad," okay? Any of that stuff would work. What is the dumbest possible thing that he could do here? Thinking about it? All right, well, here's the dumbest possible thing he could have done, which is what he does. He declares war on America. Declares war on America. We have just been stockpiling weapons for like 50 years for the Cold War, and it just ended. We have nothing to do with them. And then this tiny itty-bitty little country declares war on us because they're upset we won't let them sell their cocaine in America. Fun, all right? So we turn around and we are going to go, like, okay, if you want to fight, let's fight. So we go and we invade the tiny country of Panama, which is in Central America, it's below Mexico. We invade the country of Panama and just absolutely wreck shop. We ended up capturing Manuel Noriega. I mean, the war, I don't even know if we even called it a war. We just went down there and just wrecked shop. And we arrested Manuel Noriega, shut down the whole operation. Like the whole thing, we took over the country in like 2 weeks. So I got a video clip here of it. And this is Manuel Noriega, who we arrest and put him in jail. He is still, to this day, present day, in jail in Florida for declaring war on the United States. So I'll watch this video clip, and then I'm going to tell you something else that's really interesting about Manuel Noriega. I said play.
Noriega had seized power in the early 80s and had antagonized his old employers ever since. 4 months into Bush's watch, Panama holds general elections. Noriega has his opposition candidates beaten in the streets.
He has no real following. He's a thug, crook, witchcraft drug dealer, everything evil. And his time is up. George Bush.
The commander-in-chief deploys a division of Marines and Army Rangers into Panama City. The objective? Neutralize a rogue defense force and capture public enemy number 1, General Manuel Noriega. His forces had killed a Marine at a roadblock 3 days before. The police force is put down in a matter of hours. Tens of thousands of weapons confiscated. Noriega eventually surrenders, is extradited, tried, and convicted of drug trafficking. He's now serving 120 years in a Florida prison.
All right. So one last thing I want to tell you about Manuel Noriega, who's still in a prison in Florida today. So he's just been hanging out. I don't know if y'all know the video game Call of Duty. All right. So one of the years ago, one of the versions of Call of Duty, I don't remember which one it was, the storyline involved the whole situation with down in Panama with Manuel Noriega, and you do like a mission there, and they have like Manuel Noriega's in the game. So I guess they just forgot the dude's still alive. You can't do that, like legally. So he sues Call of Duty for using his likeness. Oh, he sues him for like $100 million. Or what else is he going to do? He's sitting in prison. He sues him for using his likeness in the game to make a profit, which he's right. They didn't like ask him if they could do it. So I don't remember how that ended up working out, but it was, they may have just said, "Shut up, Manuel, go back to your prison cell." But legally, he has a strong case. So I don't know if he got like a bunch of money from him. I mean, I don't know what he can do. He can buy like all the ramen noodles in prison he wants to from the commissary. I don't know. But so that did happen. All right, that's as far as we're going to get today, and I will see you guys tomorrow.